Hi, I'm Nina Kelly from Reframing Race.
Hi, I'm Sanjeev Lingaya from Reframing Race. So, Nina, let's talk messages that move.
Let's. So, our last session, we did talk about testing times, our flagship research report, um, and what that told us about public thinking, which we collected lots of information and answers on. But the intention really behind testing times was to find out what we could say to people to make them think differently about race and racism. And yeah, we found out a lot, which we'll get into. But maybe, Sanjeev, you just want to say a couple of words about how we got to testing times, and what we kind of wanted out of it, because it's such a big piece of work that was a long time in the making and thinking, and a lot of that thinking was yours. So yeah, give us a little insight.
Okay, so as you notice, lots of people say things are groundbreaking. I think this is groundbreaking for a few reasons. One is 20,000 people in across England and Scotland. So that means that whatever we learned, because it was a representative sample of people in both of those nations, we could read across to the whole population, so we could understand how the whole population thinks. So that was really important. I think the other thing is that the genesis of the messaging that we tested in the quantitative study came from a really considered process. So we had researched the kinds of questions that were out there in terms of opinion polling. We had looked at the kind of messages that organizations had been using. We had worked with our advocates, our reframers, to get them to tell us what were they trying to do when they were landing messages in the world. And so all of that means that we've got something quite special here. Just to say something a little bit about, and this is a bit of technical language. When we were working with our advocates, we asked how were they trying to move public thinking, and we came up with what is called framing goals, so three framing goals, which just basically means after you said something to an audience, what do you want them to take away from that interaction? And we came up with three things. Well, they especially came up with three things. One is to understand that racism is a pressing problem. Two is that it's institutionalized and systemic. And that means it isn't confined to the interpersonal realm. So it's not just, nasty shaven headed men being mean to black and brown people. And the third element was that it requires major institutional action. So those were the things that our advocates told us they wanted people to come away with, having heard their messages. So that's really key. So that kind of moved things along. Yeah. So just to say a literal spoiler alert, we have found words that move people. We have found language that moves people. There are no magic words. So you can't dissipate a few centuries of kind of deep thinking just through magic words, but you can make a difference. And I think that's hopeful. And just to say one final thing about the kind of language that we used evidence-based messages, so examples of where racial disparities, racism existed. We use metaphors. We'll talk a bit more about that later. We use policy solutions. We use some statistics. Um, and as I say, those were all distilled from what our advocates were interested in and also what the race equity movement had been saying previously. So it's really comprehensive stuff. We think we got to some good insights. And over to you, Nina, just to talk a little bit about one message that did seem to move.
Yeah, so like you say, we obviously had this kind of like wide menu of messages doing different things and trying different ways to do them. And interestingly, if there was a message, there was no silver bullet, no panacea for all, like you say. But if there was a message that was more effective, certainly in one of those markers of persuading people of the kind of institutional nature of racism, rather than it being an interpersonal thing, it was actually a statistic. And I was a bit down on statistics in our last session when we talked about, you know, back in the day when I worked at the Runnymede Trust, putting forward statistics that we had found that we felt showed institutional racism in various ways, like inequalities of outcomes. And I talked about stop and search and that statistic, which we all hear the disparity of that mentioned all the time. And it continues to be a hugely kind of racially unequal outcome there. I talked about that not moving people or not persuading people in particular ways, people receiving that fact and hearing something else, thinking something else, and therefore coming out with a different outcome. But the statistic that we found, the fact study piece of research that we found that did move people to think of racism as more structural was the CV study, which many listeners and watchers will be, viewers, I should say, would be aware of. The sum total of it is that fake CVs were sent out, some of them with kind of markers of ethnicity, if you like, so that they were kind of clearly non-white British names or kind of something in the background that's in the CV showed you that that was not a white person, essentially, were sent out to real job openings. And what came back was that you had to apply considerably more times if you had one of these kind of markers of non-white ethnicity in that CV to just get an interview. And telling the story of that kind of statistic in a narrative way. So if anyone wants to read the full message, you absolutely can. You can read all these messages in our testing times report, which is downloadable for free from our website, reframingrace.org. But telling that story of that specific kind of statistic and outcome did something to people. I think one of my kind of theories about why that works and moves people to think differently about racism, and certainly that it's not interpersonal, is that with lots of statistics, people can find non-racism related ways to explain away why that is happening. So with the stop and search one, more black men being stopped and searched than white men, well, it's because they're criminals, you know, is one kind of way of thinking about that. Even with the black maternal deaths statistic, which is really stark. You know, it was, I think, 5 times more black women dying during maternity and childbirth than their white counterparts. I think that's gone down to almost 3, but it's still, you know, multiple times more. But people can explain that away, or, you know, we see that happening with, okay, well, is it a language barrier? Maybe these women don't speak English. If they're new immigrants, have they brought different kind of diseases with them somehow? You know, is it something under their skin? Like, there are other ways of trying to kind of pick apart that clearly kind of racist statistic, if you like, with reasons that kind of explain away the racism at play. With the CV statistic, there really isn't anything else on offer to you but racism there. You know, there isn't another reason why these CVs would be treated differently, bearing in mind they were all kind of equivalent in terms of experience and qualifications, controlled really for all of those kind of factors. And I think that's the other thing, it was quite a controlled experiment rather than real kind of outcomes. And I think it's quite relatable. You know, most of us will have written a CV at some point and sent it off somewhere. And this idea of some faceless person that you'll never know making a decision possibly based on your kind of race or ethnicity is an experience that people will kind of they'll have some understanding of. And that is quite clearly a kind of institutional thing that comes back in this really real barrier to employment. So really interesting to think about how that does move people to think differently about statistics. And then just quickly to add on the end as well, you can also use this statistic, as we did in one of our messages, to create a sort of halo effect on other facts and statistics that you want to group together with it. So if you lead with the CV study and then you mention black maternal deaths, people think differently nonetheless. You know, they're more likely to think of racism as structural than interpersonal, which means that they will hopefully be thinking differently about that black maternal death statistic and wondering what kind of racial discrimination was at play there. yeah, it wasn't the only message that moved people. I think you're going to talk about a metaphor as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nina. So this is a very different approach. So one of the things that we were trying to establish in the framing goals is that racism is not just interpersonal, it's institutionalized, it's systemic. So there is a birdcage metaphor, which we borrowed from the feminist movement, actually talking about how misogyny works essentially. And the bird cage metaphor is essentially that each bar of the cage represents a constraint on freedom and possibility. And that worked well in a couple of ways. It established the idea that racism is a pressing problem, and also that it requires big institutional action. I think the metaphor was really interesting in that way because sometimes we can't always get to people by coming front on in the issue. So as you kind of talk about the stop and search figures in London, with black men certainly at one point 9 times more likely to get stopped than their counterparts. That's on the nose. But sometimes by going around the idea, like a good metaphor can do, I think we can kind of connect people a bit more powerfully. I think maybe we kind of engage their imaginations a bit more, maybe take themselves out of the moment or their own personal situations a bit more effectively. However, I should say that not all metaphors are born equal. So we tried a slightly clunky computer programming metaphor. So obviously the population doesn't really understand coding very well. So that fell a little bit flat. I think we might have done a building, like a kind of house, a
We tried
foundation,
to
or
talk
kind
about
of that,
architecture at
yeah,
some point.
like
Yeah,
that kind
that
of
didn't work.
structure, because that kind of lends itself towards structure. That didn't really go anywhere. So I think one needs to be careful about metaphors, but the birdcage kind of work because there's something about freedom and possibility that I think does resonate a lot. One thing, very briefly, to say on that is that it's also important not to assert kind of victimness in that kind of that birdcage metaphor, because we are actively resisting racism so often, but that message worked rather well, actually.
Yeah, and just to kind of reiterate, when we talk about messages working well, as these two that we've mentioned did, we are talking about specific kind of metrics that we wanted to move people on. So it's not that people kind of liked this message or they agreed with it, although we measured those sorts of things. It's, did it make them think significantly differently than they otherwise would, than the control group did, on issues of race and racism related to the markers that we wanted to move them on. So, racism being more pressing, that it was institutional and systemic rather than an interpersonal thing. And then one of the final things was that we can solve racism, that we want to motivate people to do something, and also that solutions are possible. Racism's been designed in, can we design it out? And we have to say it was harder to move people on that metric. So maybe just finally, you want to say a quick word about solutions and what we found there?
Yeah, so partly because we think the public ear is not used to hearing about solutions, we largely hear about the problems of racism or denials of the problem of racism. So, one of the things that we are doing as we move forward is to focus heavily on solutions and to get that folded into the public conversation, because that is critical for change. So, just one final thing from me. If you found this content useful, please follow us on LinkedIn or sign up for our newsletter at reframingrace.org. Thank you for listening and watching, and see you next time.